Sometimes life strips away everything you thought you were until all that's left is who you've always been. For 54-year-old Calan Crow Feather, that moment comes when he finds himself standing in the desert with nothing but his wolf Dakli and $1 in his pocket. The old covered wagon sits there like a ghost from his past. This is where he was born. This is where his mother died. This is the place his father couldn't bear to look at before sending him away to war. His Apache tribe erased his name long ago, but when Calan spends his last dollar on that broken wagon, he discovers something, hidden beneath the floorboards, something his mother left behind before she passed, a secret that's been waiting 30 years. What could a dying mother hide that would change everything? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning sun painted the Arizona desert in shades of copper and gold, casting long shadows across the dusty lot where old Tommy Begay sold forgotten things. Calan Crow Feather stood beside the covered wagon, his weathered hand resting on the cracked wooden wheel, feeling the ghost of memories he'd buried deeper than any grave. Dakli, his grey wolf companion, pressed against his leg with the quiet understanding that had kept them both alive through 8 years of wandering. The wolf's ember eyes fixed on the wagon with an intensity that made Calan's chest tighten. Animals knew things. Dakli especially knew things about the spaces between worlds, the places where the living touched the dead. You sure about this, son? Tommy's voice carried the weight of decades spent watching people make decisions they couldn't take back. The old Navajo man had known Calan's family before the world broke apart, before wars and grief scattered the pieces too far to gather again. Calan nodded, though his throat felt lined with desert sand. It's the one. The wagon looked like time had taken its revenge on it, canvas torn and sun-bleached, wood warped by seasons of heat and cold, metal fittings rusted to the color of dried blood. But underneath the decay, Calan could see the bones of what it had been. His father had built this wagon with his own hands in 1969, the year before Calan was born. The year before, everything changed. Your daddy brought you home from the hospital in this very wagon, Tommy said, his fingers tracing, the carved initials barely visible on the driver's seat. Your mama insisted on it. Said you belonged to the desert, not some white man's hospital room. The words hit like stones against Calan's ribs. He'd spent 34 years trying to forget where he came from, but the desert had a long memory. Longer than his. Tommy accepted the crumpled dollar bill without ceremony, understanding that some transactions couldn't be measured in currency. This wasn't about money. This was about a man trying to find his way back to a story that started before his first breath. The keys to that old pickup truck are in the glove box, Tommy said, gesturing to a battered Ford that looked like it had survived more battles than Calan had. Figured you'd need something to pull her with. Calan stared. The truck, too. Son, $1 don't buy much these days, but it'll buy a man his birthright if the spirits think he's earned it. Tommy's eyes held depths that spoke of ceremonies. Calan had forgotten, of prayers in languages the government schools had tried to beat out of both their fathers. Besides, Dakli, there's been telling me you two got nowhere else to go. It was true. After his discharge from the Army Rangers, Calan had drifted through 23 years of nothing. Odd jobs that lasted until someone looked too closely at his scars. Relationships that ended when he woke up screaming. Towns that became too small for the weight of what he carried. He'd learned to travel light because everything eventually got taken away. Except Dakli. The wolf had found him 8 years ago outside Flagstaff, both of them half-starved and wholly broken. Some government wildlife officer had probably been looking for Dakli, just like some VA counselor had probably been looking for Calan. But the desert was good at hiding things that didn't want to be found. Why? Calan asked. Though he wasn't sure he wanted the answer, Tommy's smile creased his face like old leather. Because your mama asked me to, right before she passed. Said someday you'd come looking for what she left behind. And when you did, I was to help you find it. The words fell between them like stones into deep water. Calan's mother had died when he was 6 months old. His father, broken by grief and rage, had raised him until the draft notice came. Then the old man had shipped him off to basic training like a package marked "Return to Sender." She left something. "Son, your mama left everything. Question is whether you're ready to carry it." Calan looked at the wagon again, seeing past the decay to the life it had contained. This was where his story began, where his mother had labored to bring him into the world during a spring sandstorm that his father said lasted 3 days, where she had died 6 months later from complications the reservation clinic couldn't treat and the white hospitals wouldn't touch. The Apache people had loved his mother. They had tolerated his father. When both were gone, they had let Calan disappear into the machinery of a war that swallowed young men and spit back strangers. "The tribe," Calan started. "The tribe remembers its children," Tommy said firmly. "Even the ones who forget themselves." Dakli padded over to the wagon and sniffed along its base, his hackles rising slightly. The wolf looked back at Calan with an expression that seemed to say, "This place holds secrets. Are you strong enough for them?" Calan had survived 3 tours in Afghanistan, 2 Purple Hearts, and more firefights than he could count. He'd led men through hell and brought most of them home. But standing in the desert heat, looking at the wagon where his life began, he felt like that 6-month-old baby again, small, vulnerable, and utterly alone. "I don't know what I'm supposed to do with it," he admitted. Tommy's hand settled on his shoulder with surprising gentleness. "Same thing you've always done, son. Survive, but maybe this time you can do more than that. Maybe you can live." The old man walked away without ceremony, leaving Calan alone with the wagon, the wolf, and the weight of a past he'd never understood. The desert stretched endlessly in all directions, patient as stone, waiting to see what this broken man would make of his inheritance. Dakli whined softly and pressed closer, his wild instincts recognizing something Calan's civilized mind couldn't yet accept. This wasn't just a transaction. This wasn't just coming home. This was the beginning of something that would change everything they thought they knew about who they were and why they were still alive. The sun climbed higher, and the desert held its breath. 3 days passed before Calan found the courage to truly examine what he'd bought with his last dollar. The wagon sat in the shade of a lone cottonwood tree, 30 miles from Tommy's lot, in a place where the desert opened like cupped hands. Around a natural spring. Dakli had led him here, following some instinct older than human memory. The wolf refused to enter the wagon. He would circle it, sniff at the wheels, even rest in its shadow. But the moment Calan lifted the canvas flap, Dakli would retreat to the spring and watch with those unsettling amber eyes. "What do you know that I don't?" Calan asked. But the wolf only tilted his head and maintained his vigil. Inside, the wagon smelled of time and sorrow. Dust motes danced in shafts of sunlight that penetrated the torn canvas like fingers reaching for something lost. The floorboards creaked under Calan's weight, protesting years of neglect. He'd been avoiding this moment, telling himself he was just checking the structural integrity, making sure the axles could handle being moved. Truth was, he was afraid. Afraid of what he might remember, afraid of what he might feel. The interior was smaller than he'd expected, though he supposed everything seemed smaller when you returned as a grown man. A few pieces of furniture remained, a broken chair, a wooden crate that might have served as a table, the metal frame of what had once been a bed. His parents' bed, the bed where his mother had labored to bring him into the world. Calan knelt beside the crate, running his fingers along the wood grain. Someone had carved initials here too, though these were harder to make out. JCF and MBF James Crow Feather and Maria Blue Fox Crow Feather, his parents, young and in love, marking their claim on forever. Forever had lasted 6 months. He began clearing debris, moving methodically as he'd been trained. Old newspapers from the 1970s, fragments of pottery, a child's toy horse carved from pine. Each artifact felt like a piece of a puzzle he'd never learned how to solve. It was Dakli's sudden howl that made him look closer at the floorboards. The wolf had finally approached the wagon, but he wasn't trying to enter. He was digging at the base of it, his claws scraping against wood and earth with increasing urgency. The sound he made wasn't quite a bark, wasn't quite a howl, something between warning and recognition. "Easy, boy," Calan said. But when he knelt beside the wolf, he saw what had caught Dakli's attention. The floorboards near the rear of the wagon didn't match the others. The wood was slightly different in color, the nails newer. Someone had replaced this section, and recently enough that the wood hadn't weathered to match the rest. Calan's military training kicked in. When something looked out of place, it usually was. He found his combat knife and began working at the edges of the mismatched boards. The nails came up easier than they should have, as if they'd been removed and replaced multiple times. The first board lifted away, revealing dark earth beneath. The second board was harder, warped by moisture. But when it finally gave way, Calan's breath caught in his throat. There, nestled in a carefully hollowed space, lay a bundle wrapped in oiled leather. Beside it, something that made his chest tighten with recognition, a cradle board, intricately carved with symbols he half remembered from dreams. Apache symbols. His symbols. With shaking hands, he lifted the cradle board. The leather straps were cracked with age, but the woodwork remained beautiful. Someone had spent months crafting this, pouring love into every detail. Along the bottom edge, barely visible, someone had carved letters with the tip of a knife. Calan James Crow Feather, born April 15th, 1970. His name, his full name, including the middle name he'd never known he had, James, after his father. But it was the leather bundle that made him forget how to breathe. The wrapping fell away to reveal an envelope, yellowed with time, but still sealed. The paper was good quality, better than anything his family should have been able to afford. Across the front, in careful script that he somehow recognized though he'd never seen it before, were the words, "For my son, when he comes home." His mother's handwriting, it had to be. Calan sat back on his heels, the envelope trembling in his hands. Outside, Dakli had gone completely silent. The desert itself seemed to be holding its breath, waiting to see what secrets would finally come to light. The envelope felt heavier than paper should. Inside, he could feel multiple pages, something small and hard, maybe a piece of jewelry or a key. 34 years this message had waited. 34 years. His mother's words had lain buried beneath the floor of the place where he was born. His hands shook as he broke the seal. The first thing that fell out was a medal. Congressional Medal of Honor. The ribbon faded, but the metal still bright. His father's name was engraved on the back, James Robert Crow Feather, Staff Sergeant, United States Army, Vietnam. Calan stared at it in disbelief. His father had been a decorated war hero? The bitter, broken man who'd shipped him off to the army without a word of goodbye. That man had been awarded the nation's highest honor for valor. He unfolded the letter with numb fingers, his mother's careful script blurring as his eyes filled with tears he hadn't shed in 20 years. "My beloved son," it began, "if you are reading this, then you have found your way home and I am gone. Your father made me promise not to tell you these things while he lived, but death has a way of changing promises." The words continued, each line rewriting everything Calan thought he knew about his life. His father, his exile from the tribe. His mother had been pregnant with twins. His brother had been stillborn, or so he'd been told. His father hadn't been broken by grief alone, but by guilt. He'd been protecting something, someone, and that protection had cost him everything. "The Apache elders didn't exile you," the letter continued. "Your father sent you away to keep you safe. There were men who would have used you to hurt him, to hurt the tribe. He sacrificed his relationship with you to protect something larger than both of you." Calan's world tilted sideways. Everything he'd believed, every source of anger and abandonment that had driven him through 3 decades of wandering, it was all built on a lie, not a malicious lie, but a protective one. Outside, Dakli began to howl again, a sound that seemed to echo across the desert like a call to spirits both ancient and eternal. The truth was finally coming home. The letter contained 3 more pages that turned Calan's understanding of his life inside out. His mother's words painted a picture of his father not as the broken drunk he remembered, but as a man carrying impossible weight, protecting tribal lands from development companies that would destroy sacred burial grounds, shielding his infant son from men who would use any leverage to get what they wanted. "Your father never spoke of Vietnam," Maria had written, "but I saw him wake up screaming every night for 5 years. The medal they gave him came with a price, survivor's guilt that ate at him like cancer. When the land developers threatened our people's burial grounds, he became the only one willing to stand against them. They tried to bribe him, then threaten him. When that failed, they targeted you." Calan read the passage 3 times before it sank in. Men had threatened to harm him as a baby to pressure his father. The exile hadn't been abandonment. It had been protection. The day he sent you to the army, he cried for the first time since Vietnam, but he said it was the only way to keep you alive long enough to become strong enough to fight your own battles. Dakli had finally entered the wagon, settling beside Calan with his massive head resting on his paws. The wolf's presence was steady, grounding, a reminder that some bonds transcended words or understanding. Outside, the desert afternoon was giving way to the deep blue of evening. Calan needed to process what he'd learned, but first he needed to understand more about his father's military service. The medal was real enough, but the man he remembered had never mentioned Vietnam, never spoke of heroism or honor. Tommy Begay had mentioned a tribal office in White River, about 2 hours north. If anyone had records of his father's involvement in protecting the lands, it would be there. But more immediately, he needed to verify what his mother had written about his father's military service. The next morning, Calan drove the 40 miles to the VA office in Globe, Arizona. Dakli rode in the truck bed, alert and watchful, as if he understood the significance of their mission. The wolf had become more than a companion over the years. He was a barometer for danger, a bridge between the civilized world and something older, more instinctive. The VA office was exactly what Calan expected. Fluorescent lights, worn carpeting, and the particular smell of bureaucracy mixed with desperation. But the clerk behind the counter, a middle-aged Latina woman named Rosa, seemed genuinely interested in helping when Calan explained what he needed. "James Crow Feather," she said, typing into her computer. "Staff Sergeant, discharged 1968. Her eyebrows rose. "Oh my, Congressional Medal of Honor recipient. That's rare. What did he do to earn it?" Rosa's expression grew somber as she read. From the screen, single-handedly held off a Viet Cong assault that would have overrun a field hospital, saved 37 wounded soldiers and medical personnel, sustained multiple wounds but continued fighting for 14 hours until reinforcements arrived. She looked up at Calan. "Your father?" Calan nodded, though the word father felt strange in his mouth. He'd spent so many years thinking of James Crow Feather as the man who'd abandoned him, that claiming him as family required conscious effort. Says here, he was recommended for the Medal of Honor by 3 separate commanding officers. The ceremony was in 1970, but according to this, he never attended. Medal was mailed to his home address in Arizona, the year Calan was born. His father had been too busy becoming a new parent, and according to his mother's letter, too busy protecting tribal lands to accept the nation's highest honor in person. Rosa printed out the service record and handed it to Calan. "You should be proud," she said softly. "Men like your father are why the rest of us got to come home." But that wasn't the whole story, Calan realized, as he drove back toward the spring where he'd camped. His father had come home from Vietnam, but he'd never really left the war behind. The medal represented everything admirable about his service, but it also represented the weight of survival when others didn't make it. Then he'd come back to Arizona only to find himself fighting a different kind of war, one where the enemy wore suits instead of uniforms and used legal documents instead of bullets. That evening, Calan built a fire near the spring and read his mother's letter again by flickering light. Dakli lay beside him, occasionally lifting his head to scent the night air for threats that existed mostly in memory. The third page of the letter contained names, men who had worked with his father to protect the burial grounds, elders who had supported their efforts, and officials who had been bought by the development companies. At the bottom, his mother had written something that made Calan's breath catch. "Mary Littlefoot remembers everything. If you want to understand your father's sacrifice, find her. Mary Littlefoot." Even 34 years later, the name stirred something in Calan's memory. A woman with kind eyes and steady hands, someone who had held him when he was small, who had sung to him in Apache when his father was too broken by nightmares to provide comfort. According to his mother's letter, Mary was his father's cousin, a tribal elder who had served as unofficial keeper of the old stories. If she was still alive, she would be in her 70s now, but Apache women were known for their longevity and their long memories. The next morning, Calan hitched the wagon to Tommy's old truck and began the journey to White River. It was time to stop running from his past and start understanding it. Dakli rode in the truck cab this time, his yellow eyes fixed on the road ahead, as if he too sensed they were approaching something significant. The drive took them through landscapes that grew increasingly familiar as they climbed into the mountains. This was Apache country, the land his ancestors had fought and died to protect. Every mile brought back fragments of memory, a particular bend in the road, the way the light fell across a certain meadow, the scent of pine and sage that spoke of home in a language older than English. Halfway to White River, Calan pulled over at a scenic overlook and got out to stretch his legs. The view stretched for miles across forested mountains and hidden valleys. Somewhere out there were the burial grounds his father had died protecting. Somewhere out there, Mary Littlefoot was waiting with the rest of the story. Dakli jumped down from the truck and padded to the edge of the overlook, his ears pricked forward. For a moment, Calan could have sworn the wolf was listening to something beyond human hearing. The voices of the past, perhaps, or the whisper of destiny calling them home. Whatever it was, they were ready to answer. Mary Littlefoot lived in a modest adobe house on the outskirts of White River, surrounded by a garden that seemed to grow everything the desert had no business supporting. Tomatoes climbed wooden stakes in neat rows, squash blossoms spread across carefully tended mounds, and somewhere in the organized chaos, Calan could smell sage and sweetgrass burning in ceremony. She answered the door before he knocked, as if she'd been expecting him for 34 years. "Calan James Crow Feather," she said, and her voice carried the same warmth he remembered from childhood dreams he'd thought were imagination. "You look like your father, but you have your mother's eyes." Mary was smaller than his memory had painted. Her grey hair braided with strips of leather and turquoise, her hands gnarled with arthritis, but still steady. She wore a simple cotton dress and moccasins that looked hand-beaded. When she smiled, the years fell away, and Calan was 6 years old again, safe in the arms of someone who loved him without conditions. "Aunt Mary," he said, using the honorific that felt natural, though they shared no blood. Among the Apache, family was defined by more than genetics. "I've been keeping coffee warm for you," she said, stepping back to let him enter. "Your wolf is welcome too, though he might not care for my cat." Dakli had indeed spotted a large orange tabby sunning itself on Mary's porch rail. The wolf and cat regarded each other with the mutual respect of predators who had learned to coexist in human spaces. After a moment, Dakli settled into the shade while the cat continued its nap, apparently unimpressed by the intrusion. Mary's house was a museum of Apache life. baskets woven in patterns that told stories, pottery painted with symbols that held meaning, photographs spanning generations of a family that had survived everything history could throw at them. The coffee was strong and bitter, served in cups that had seen decades of similar conversations. "You found your mother's letter," Mary said. "It wasn't a question. You knew about it?" "Child, I helped her write it." Mary settled into a chair that seemed molded to her shape. "Your mother couldn't read or write English well, but she could speak it. I took down her words and wrote them in script she could copy." The revelation hit Calan like a physical blow. His mother had been illiterate, but she'd been determined to leave him a message that might someday bring him home. The careful handwriting he'd admired represented hours of painstaking copying, every letter formed with love and hope that he might one day return to read them. "Tell me about my father," Calan said. Mary's expression grew complex, mixing pride with sorrow. "Your father was the bravest man I ever knew, and the most broken. Vietnam didn't just wound his body, it cracked his spirit in places that never healed right." She stood and moved to a bookshelf, returning with a leather portfolio tied with sinew. Inside were photographs, letters and documents that painted a picture of James Crow Feather that bore little resemblance to the man Calan remembered. The first photograph showed his father in dress uniform, receiving the Medal of Honor from President Nixon. James looked young and uncomfortable, his eyes distant even as he accepted the nation's highest decoration. But it was the second photograph that stopped Calan's breath. His father, holding an infant, both of them standing beside the covered wagon. The baby was reaching for James's face, and for just that moment, captured in black and white, the haunted look was gone from his father's eyes. "That's you, 3 days old," Mary said softly. "He carried you everywhere those first months, said you were the only thing that made him feel human again. Then why? Because loving you made you a target." Mary's voice carried the weight of old pain. The development company, Southwestern Holdings, they wanted the burial grounds for a copper mine. Your father was the only tribal member with enough military training and leadership experience to organize effective resistance. She pulled out a map, hand-drawn on deerskin, showing the locations of sacred sites throughout the reservation. Red marks indicated burial grounds that were under threat. Blue marks showed areas already destroyed by previous development projects. They offered him money first. When he refused, they threatened the entire tribal council. When that didn't work, they started making more personal threats. Mary's finger traced a path on the map. They told him they knew where you slept, knew your mother's schedule, knew exactly how to hurt him, where he was most vulnerable. Calan studied the map, his military training automatically assessing tactical advantages and vulnerabilities. The burial grounds were scattered across some of the most remote and defensible terrain on the reservation, perfect for guerrilla resistance, but also perfect for making people disappear. So he sent me away. He enlisted you in the army before. You were old enough to have a choice, Mary confirmed. Said if you were going to be a warrior anyway, you might as well learn from the best teachers in the world. And if you were far enough away, they couldn't use you against him. Did it work? Mary's smile was grim. For a while. Your father and a handful of other veterans held them off for 3 years. They sabotaged equipment, tied up legal proceedings, made the project so expensive and complicated that Southwestern Holdings finally gave up. She paused, her expression growing darker. But your father paid a price. The stress, the constant vigilance, the guilt over sending you away. It ate at him. He started drinking more, sleeping less. When he died in that car accident in 1995, I always wondered if it was really an accident. The words settled between them like stones thrown into still water. Calan had received notification of his father's death while deployed in Somalia, but by the time he could arrange leave, the funeral was long over. He'd told himself it didn't matter. That James Crow Feather had been dead to him long before the car accident made it official. Now, sitting in Mary's kitchen with evidence of his father's sacrifice spread before him, he felt the weight of 28 years of misplaced anger. "The burial grounds," he said finally. "Are they still safe?" Mary's expression grew troubled. "For now. But Southwestern Holdings has been bought by a larger company, Desert Vista Development. They're making noise again, filing new environmental impact studies, hiring lobbyists. The old agreements your father negotiated are being challenged in federal court." She pulled out a thick folder of legal documents, many stamped with recent dates. "They're claiming that changing economic conditions invalidate the previous protections. They want to reopen the copper mining question." Calan felt something shifting inside him, the same tactical awareness that had kept him alive through 3 tours of combat. This wasn't just about the past anymore. This was about a threat that was very much present, very much active. Who's fighting them now? A few younger tribal members, but they don't have your father's military experience or organizational skills. They're passionate, but they're outgunned by corporate lawyers and lobbyists. Mary leaned forward, her eyes intense. "Your father always said you'd come back when the people needed you most. I think maybe that time is now." Outside, Dakli lifted his head and looked toward the mountains. His ears pricked forward as if he'd heard something beyond human perception. The afternoon light was starting to fade, painting the landscape in shades of gold and rust. Calan looked at the map again, seeing it now not as historical artifact, but as potential battlefield. His father's war wasn't over. It had just been waiting for the next generation to pick up the fight. The question was whether he was ready to claim that inheritance. The Desert Vista development offices in Phoenix looked like every other corporate fortress Calan had seen, glass and steel rising from manicured landscaping that required more water than most reservation families used in a year. He'd driven the 3 hours south with a folder full of documents Mary had given him, and a growing sense that his father's war was about to become his own. The receptionist, a young woman with perfectly styled blonde hair and a smile that never reached her eyes, directed him to the 15th floor where the Environmental Compliance Department operated behind doors marked with corporate logos and legal disclaimers. Richard Hawkins, Senior Vice President of Land Acquisition, was exactly what Calan had expected. Expensive suit, aggressive handshake, and the kind of confidence that came from never having been told no by anyone who mattered. His office overlooked the Salt River Valley, a sprawling testament to humanity's determination to make the desert bloom regardless of cost. "Mr. Crow Feather," Hawkins said, gesturing to a leather chair positioned to put visitors at a psychological disadvantage. "I understand. You have concerns about our Apache Highlands project." Apache Highlands. They'd given the mining operation a name that sounded like a luxury resort, complete with marketing materials that showed happy families hiking through pristine wilderness. No mention of the sacred burial grounds that would be destroyed, the ancient petroglyphs that would be blasted away, the spiritual heart of a people that would be reduced to tonnage calculations. "I have concerns about your company's plans to desecrate my ancestors' graves," Calan said, keeping his voice level despite the rage building in his chest. Hawkins's smile didn't waver. "I think there's been some misunderstanding. Desert Vista Development has gone to extraordinary lengths to work with tribal leadership on this project. We've offered substantial compensation for land use rights, guaranteed employment for tribal members, and committed to state-of-the-art environmental restoration once mining operations conclude." He pulled out a presentation folder thick with charts and graphs designed to make destruction look like progress. "The Apache Highlands project will bring $40 million in direct investment to the region, create over 300 jobs, and generate tax revenue that will fund tribal programs for generations. And all it costs is our sacred sites. Mr. Crow Feather, I understand your emotional attachment to these locations, but we're talking about economic opportunities that could transform your people's future. Surely your tribal council sees the wisdom in embracing progress rather than clinging to the past." The casual dismissal of centuries of spiritual tradition as emotional attachment told Calan everything he needed to know about what he was facing. These men saw Apache burial grounds the same way they saw any other obstacle to profit, something to be managed, minimized, or eliminated. "Show me the environmental impact study," Calan said. Hawkins hesitated for the first time. "I'm afraid those documents are proprietary until the official review period begins. Show me the study, or I walk out of here and you deal with tribal lawyers instead of tribal members." After a moment's calculation, Hawkins pulled out a thinner folder. The environmental impact study was a masterpiece of corporate doublespeak, hundreds of pages that managed to describe the complete destruction of an ecosystem while making it. Sound like ecological improvement, but Calan's military training had taught him to read between the lines of official documents. And what he found made his blood run cold. The mining operation would require the removal of over 200,000 tons of earth. Chemical processing would use a cyanide leaching process that had contaminated groundwater at similar operations across the southwest. The timeline showed a 20-year extraction period, followed by what the study euphemistically called site restoration. What they were really describing was the complete destruction of a landscape that had remained unchanged since his ancestors first walked this land. "The water table," Calan said, pointing to a particularly damaging section of the report. "Your operation will contaminate the aquifer that supplies drinking water to 3 reservations." "That's a worst-case scenario projection," Hawkins said, smoothly. "Our engineers have designed containment systems that exceed all federal requirements. The same engineers who designed containment systems for the Berkeley pit in Montana, or maybe the ones who worked on the Iron Mountain mine in California." Hawkins's smile finally faltered. Both sites were environmental disasters that would require centuries and billions of dollars to remediate, if remediation was even possible. The fact that Calan knew about them suggested he was more than just another concerned tribal member. "I think we may have gotten off on the wrong foot," Hawkins said, his tone shifting to something that might have been meant as conciliatory. "Desert. Vista Development is committed to being a good neighbor to the Apache people. Perhaps we could discuss ways your particular concerns might be addressed." It was an opening for negotiation, an invitation to be bought off with promises and compensation. Packages. Calan could see the calculation in the man's eyes. Every protester had a price. Every opposition could be managed with the right combination of money and pressure. "My particular concern," Calan said, standing to leave, "is that you people seem to think Apache burial grounds are for sale. Everything is for sale, Mr. Crow Feather. It's just a matter of finding the right price." The words followed Calan out of the building and into the Phoenix heat. As he walked to his truck, he could feel Hawkins watching from the 15th floor window, probably already on the phone with lawyers and lobbyists who specialized in making problems like Calan disappear. Dakli was waiting in the truck bed, panting in the shade but alert. The wolf had refused to remain in Mary's garden, insisting on accompanying Calan, even though he had to wait outside. It was as if Dakli understood that this was reconnaissance, that they were gathering intelligence on an enemy that threatened everything they'd come home to protect. The drive back to White River gave Calan time to process what he'd learned. Desert. Vista Development wasn't just another mining company. They were a subsidiary of Meridian Industries, a multinational corporation with projects on 6 continents and a track record of environmental destruction that read like a catalogue of human greed. They had resources that dwarfed anything the Apache tribes could muster, legal teams that specialized in crushing indigenous resistance, and political connections that reached from local zoning boards to federal regulatory agencies. But they also had something Calan recognized from his military days: the overconfidence that came from winning too many easy battles. They were used to dealing with protesters who played by conventional rules, who could be intimidated by lawsuits or bought off with promises of economic development. They weren't prepared for someone who had spent 23 years learning how to fight asymmetric warfare against better-funded enemies. By the time Calan reached Mary's house, the sun was setting behind the mountains, painting the sky in shades of fire that reminded him why the Apache called this the land of the sacred. Colors. Mary was waiting on her porch, her orange cat curled in her lap, both of them watching the road as if they'd been expecting him. "How did it go?" she asked, as Dakli jumped down from the truck and padded over to drink from a bowl she'd set out. "For him, they're planning to destroy everything," Calan said, sitting heavily in the chair beside her. "The burial grounds, the petroglyphs, the entire watershed. They want to turn our ancestors' resting place into an open-pit mine." Mary nodded as if she'd expected as much. "Your father always said they'd be back eventually. Corporate memory is longer than human memory and more patient. They offered to buy me off." And Calan looked out at the mountains where his father had fought and died to protect Apache sacred sites, where generations of his people had found peace and meaning in landscape that was about to be reduced to profit margins and tonnage calculations. "I think it's time I learned what my father was really fighting for." The sacred sites were nothing like Calan had expected. He'd imagined elaborate monuments, obvious markers of spiritual significance that even corporate lawyers couldn't ignore. Instead, Mary led him to places that looked like ordinary desert landscape until you knew how to see them. The first burial ground was a natural depression ringed by ancient oak trees. Their branches twisted into shapes that seemed to reach toward the sky in permanent supplication. To an untrained eye, it might have looked like any other clearing in the high desert. But when Mary began to sing in Apache, her voice carrying across the stillness, Calan felt something shift in the air, a presence that was both welcoming and watchful. "Your great-great-grandmother is buried here," Mary said, kneeling beside a stone formation that revealed itself as a carefully constructed cairn only when seen from the right angle. She was a healer, one of the last to know all the old songs. Dakli had been restless during the drive up the mountain, but now he settled beside the cairn with unusual stillness, his amber eyes fixed on something beyond the physical world. The wolf's behavior around sacred places had been consistent throughout their journey, a deep quiet that suggested he could sense the spiritual significance even when Calan couldn't. "How many burial sites are there?" Calan asked. 43. "In the area marked for mining," Mary replied. "Some hold single graves, others are family plots spanning generations. This one," she gestured to the depression around them, "contains the remains of 67 Apache who died defending this land from cavalry raids in the 1880s. The weight of history settled on Calan's shoulders like a physical presence. These weren't just graves, they were a testament to his people's connection to this specific landscape, irreplaceable links in a chain of memory that stretched back centuries. Over the next 3 days, Mary took him to site after site, each one revealing layers of meaning invisible to outside observers. Petroglyphs that recorded astronomical observations made by Apache astronomers 500 years ago. Spring-fed pools where coming-of-age ceremonies had been conducted since before European contact. Medicine wheels aligned with celestial events that still guided tribal spiritual practices, and scattered throughout, like seeds of resistance, were the signs of his father's war. Camouflaged observation posts built into rock formations, supply caches hidden in places only someone with intimate knowledge of the terrain could find. Communication systems using mirrors and smoke that could coordinate resistance across dozens of square miles without electronic surveillance being able to intercept them. "Your father was preparing for a long campaign," Mary explained as they examined a shelter built into a natural cave system. He knew they'd eventually come back with more lawyers, more money, more political pressure, so he built infrastructure that could support sustained resistance. The cave contained supplies that were still good after nearly 3 decades. Military rations, medical supplies, ammunition for weapons Calan hoped they wouldn't need to use. But it also contained something more precious, his father's journals, documenting every encounter with corporate representatives, every legal maneuver, every political alliance forged in the fight to protect Apache sacred sites. Reading his father's careful notes by lamplight, Calan began to understand the scope of what James Crow Feather had been attempting. This hadn't been simple environmental activism. It had been a comprehensive strategy to create permanent legal protections for tribal sacred sites, using a combination of federal environmental law, Native American religious freedom legislation, and tactical delay that would make development economically unfeasible. He was winning, Calan said, looking up from a journal entry dated just weeks before his father's death. The legal challenges were succeeding. Southwestern Holdings was running out of money and political capital. Mary's expression grew sad. That's when accidents started happening to people who opposed them. Equipment failures, car crashes, house fires that couldn't be explained. The implication hung between them, like smoke from a dying fire. James Crow Feather's death might not have been the random accident Calan had always believed. You think they killed him. I think your father was driving a road he'd traveled thousands of times when his brakes failed on a curve that shouldn't have been dangerous to anyone with his driving experience, Mary said quietly. And I think the investigation was closed very quickly by officials who had suddenly developed expensive tastes. That evening, back at Mary's house, she brought out the final piece of his father's legacy, a medicine bundle wrapped in deer hide and tied with sinew that had been blessed by 4 generations of Apache medicine men. Inside were objects that connected Calan not just to his father, but to an unbroken line of spiritual tradition stretching back to the beginning of Apache memory. Eagle feathers blessed in ceremonies he barely remembered. Sage and sweetgrass harvested from the sacred sites now under threat. Stones from the burial grounds that held the spiritual essence of his ancestors. And at the center, a piece of turquoise carved into the shape of a wolf, his spiritual guardian, waiting patiently for him to remember who he was meant to be. Your mother made this bundle the week before she died, Mary said, her voice soft with memory. She said you would need it someday, when you were ready to carry forward what your father started. Calan held the wolf carving up to the lamplight, feeling its weight in his palm. Dakli raised his head from where he'd been resting, his amber eyes reflecting the stone's blue-green depths. For a moment, the 2 wolves, one flesh, one spirit, seemed to acknowledge each other across the boundary between worlds. I don't know the ceremonies, Calan admitted. I don't speak enough Apache. I don't know how to be what they need me to be. Mary's smile was gentle but firm. Your father didn't know how to be a warrior when the army drafted him, but he learned. Because the alternative was death. You'll learn what you need to learn, because the alternative is the death of everything your ancestors died to protect. Over the following week, Mary began teaching him what she could of Apache spiritual practice. Not the sacred ceremonies that required years of preparation and formal initiation, but the basic prayers, the daily observances, the ways of seeing and being that connected a person to the living landscape around them. Dakli proved to be an excellent student, seeming to understand the ritual significance of their actions, even when Calan struggled with the unfamiliar words and gestures. The wolf would position himself at cardinal points during prayers, would remain motionless during sacred songs, would alert them to spiritual presences that human senses couldn't detect. Animals are closer to the spirit world than we are, Mary explained after watching Dakli guide them to a hidden spring that didn't appear on any map. They don't question what they feel. They don't analyze it or try to make it fit into boxes. They just accept the guidance and act on it. It was good advice for more than just spiritual practice. Calan's military training had taught him to trust his instincts, to act on information that couldn't always be verified through conventional intelligence gathering. The corporate world operated by different rules, but the principles of asymmetric warfare remained the same. Use your enemy's size and bureaucracy against them. Strike where they're not prepared to defend. Make them fight on ground of your choosing. The end of the week, Calan had developed the outline of a strategy. Desert Vista Development was counting on facing the same kind of opposition they'd overcome before. Legal challenges that could be delayed until funding ran out. Protests that could be managed through public relations campaigns. Tribal leadership that could be divided through selective bribery and political pressure. They weren't expecting to face someone who understood that this was war, and who had spent 23 years learning how to fight wars that couldn't be won through conventional means. But first, he needed to understand exactly what he was up against. The documents he'd seen at Desert Vista's offices were just marketing materials. The real planning would be happening at higher levels, involving resources and connections that wouldn't show up in environmental impact studies or public relations presentations. That night, as he prepared to leave Mary's house and return to the covered wagon that had become his base camp, she handed him one final gift, a cell phone number written on a piece of paper. "Thomas Yazzie," she said. "He's about your age. Grew up on the reservation but got a law degree from Stanford. He's been working pro bono on tribal land rights cases for the past 5 years." Calan looked at the number, recognizing it as another piece of the network his father had been building, a web of relationships and resources that could be activated when the time was right. "Your father always said the fight would require both warriors and lawyers," Mary added. "Maybe it's time to bring them together." As Calan drove back through the darkness toward his camp, Dakli alert beside him in the passenger seat, he felt something he hadn't experienced in 34 years, the sense of belonging to something larger than himself. Not just to a family or a tribe, but to a story that had been unfolding for generations, a story that he was finally ready to help. Right. The sacred sites were waiting in the darkness ahead, holding their secrets and their power. Somewhere in Phoenix, corporate executives were making plans to destroy everything his ancestors had died to protect. But they had made one critical mistake. They had assumed that James Crow Feather's son would be as easy to defeat as James Crow Feather himself had been. They were about to learn otherwise. The DNA test results arrived on a Tuesday morning that started like any other. Calan had been living in the restored wagon for 3 weeks, using it as a base while he learned the terrain and built relationships with younger tribal members who were ready to fight for their sacred sites. Thomas Yazzie had proven to be exactly what Mary had promised. A sharp legal mind with deep connections in both tribal and federal courts. But it was Dr. Sarah Chen at the Phoenix DNA testing facility who delivered the news that would change everything Calan thought he knew about his mission. "Mr. Crow Feather," she said over the phone, her voice carrying the careful neutrality of someone trained to deliver unexpected information. "I need to discuss your results in person. Are you available to come to Phoenix today?" The drive south gave Calan too much time to think. He'd submitted the DNA sample on Thomas's advice, hoping to establish definitive proof of his connection to the burial grounds in case corporate lawyers challenged his standing to speak for Apache interests. It should have been a routine confirmation of what he already knew about his heritage. Dr. Chen's office was small and clinical, decorated with certificates and family photos that suggested a life dedicated to solving genetic puzzles. She was younger than he'd expected, probably in her early 30s, with the kind of intense focus that came from working with information that could reshape people's understanding of themselves. "Your DNA shows markers consistent with Apache heritage," she began, pulling out a thick folder of test results. "But there's something unusual that I wanted to discuss with you personally." She spread several charts across her desk, pointing to patterns of genetic markers that meant nothing to Calan, but clearly held significance for her. "Mr. Crow Feather, have you ever been told that you were a twin?" The question hit him like physical blow. He remembered his mother's letter mentioning twins, but she'd written that his brother had been stillborn. "My mother said I had a twin brother who died at birth," Dr. Chen's expression grew carefully neutral. According to these results, you have a living, identical twin. The markers are absolutely definitive. There's someone out there who shares virtually all of your genetic code. Calan stared at the charts without really seeing them. A living twin brother. Someone who had shared the same womb, the same DNA, the same potential for life. Someone who had been separated from him for 54 years. How is that possible? My mother. Sometimes births are recorded incorrectly, especially in rural areas with limited medical facilities, Dr. Chen said gently. Sometimes families make decisions about separated twins that they believe are in the children's best interests. She handed him a supplementary report. I ran your sample against several national databases. Your twin's DNA profile appears in corporate executive background checks. The name associated with it is Michael Hawkins. The world tilted sideways. Hawkins. The same name as the Desert Vista development executive who had tried to buy him off. 2 weeks ago. Dr. Chen, Calan said, his voice barely above a whisper. Can you tell me anything else about this Michael Hawkins? She hesitated, clearly weighing professional discretion against human compassion. The database entries show employment with Meridian Industries, Desert Vista Development's parent company. Executive level, based on the security clearance requirements. She paused. Mr. Crow Feather, are you familiar with that company? Familiar didn't begin to cover it. Desert Vista Development was the company planning to destroy Apache burial grounds. For profit. Meridian Industries was the corporate giant backing them, and somewhere in that hierarchy was his identical twin brother, the other half of himself that had been missing for 54 years. The implications crashed over him in waves. His brother wasn't just working for the enemy, he might be the enemy. The executive who had dismissed Apache's spiritual concerns as emotional attachment might share his DNA, his face, everything except the experiences that had made them who they were. I need contact information, Calan said. Dr. Chen shook her head. I can't provide that, but the database entries I accessed suggest he's based in Denver at Meridian's regional headquarters. The drive back to the reservation passed in a blur of desert landscape and racing thoughts. How could his parents have separated twins? Why would they give one son away to be raised by the enemy? What had happened in those first months of life that had split one soul into 2 different worlds? By the time he reached Mary's house, the sun was setting behind the mountains in shades of fire that reminded him why the Apache called this the land of the sacred colors. Mary took one look at his face and ushered him inside without questions, settling him at her kitchen table with coffee and the kind of patient silence that invited confession. I have a twin brother, Calan said finally. He's alive. And he works for the company trying to destroy our burial grounds. Mary's hands stilled on her coffee cup. For a long moment, the only sound was the ticking of an old clock on the mantelpiece. Michael, she said quietly, you knew. Mary's expression crumpled with the weight of a secret carried too long. Your mother made me promise never to tell you. Unless, she stopped, gathering herself, unless the 2 paths crossed again. She disappeared into her bedroom, returning with another leather portfolio that looked identical to the one containing his father's war records. Inside were birth certificates, adoption papers, and a series of photographs that showed 2 identical babies being held by different families. Your mother carried twins, but the birth was complicated. You were born first, healthy and strong. Michael came 20 minutes later, but there were problems. Breathing difficulties, a heart murmur that required surgery. Mary's voice grew soft with memory. The reservation clinic wasn't equipped for the level of care he needed. The photographs showed his brother connected to medical equipment in what looked like a major hospital facility, surrounded by white doctors and nurses who clearly had resources the reservation clinic lacked. A wealthy family from Denver, the Hawkinses, had been trying to adopt a Native American child. They had connections with the hospital, agreed to pay for all the medical treatment in exchange for adoption rights. Mary looked up at him with eyes full of old pain. Your parents had to choose between letting Michael die on the reservation or letting him live in the white world. So they gave him away. They saved his life, and they made the people who took him promise to tell him about his Apache heritage when he was old enough to understand. Mary's voice carried the weight of betrayal. The Hawkinses never kept that promise. They raised him as their own son, never told him he was adopted, never told him about you or his birth family. Calan stared at the photographs, seeing his own face reflected in medical equipment and surrounded by a world that had never touched his life. His brother had grown up with every advantage Calan had been denied: wealth, education, connections, opportunity. But he had also grown up without knowing who he really was, without understanding the spiritual connection to the land that defined Apache identity. "There's more," Mary said, pulling out the final document in the portfolio. It was a traditional Apache prophecy, written in both Apache and English, describing the return of twin brothers who would either destroy or save the sacred lands together. "Your great-great-grandmother was a prophet," Mary said. "She saw the coming of the mining companies, saw the threat to our burial grounds. But she also saw that salvation would come through the reunion of twin souls, two halves of the same spirit, one raised in each world, coming together to heal what had been broken." Calan read the prophecy 3 times before its full implications sank in. He wasn't just fighting to protect Apache's sacred sites from corporate destruction. He was fighting to reunite with a brother who didn't know he existed, to heal a wound that had been bleeding for 54 years. The question was whether Michael Hawkins, his twin brother, his other half, his spiritual mirror, would be his greatest ally or his most dangerous enemy. The prophecy stone sat in Mary's living room like a piece of the mountain itself, had decided to take up residence among her books and photographs. Thomas Yazzie had helped transport it from the sacred cave where it had waited for over 2 centuries, its surface covered with symbols that seemed to shift in the lamplight. "The writing says the twin souls will meet when the sacred earth faces its greatest danger," Mary translated, her fingers tracing lines carved by Apache hands before European contact. "One brother will carry the memory of the ancestors. The other will carry the power of the new world. Together they will either heal the wound in the earth or complete its destruction." Calan had been staring at the prophecy for 3 days, trying to understand how he was supposed to approach a brother who didn't know he existed, who worked for the company planning to destroy everything their ancestors had died to protect. Dakli hadn't left his side since the stone's arrival, the wolf's amber eyes fixed on the carved symbols, as if he could read meaning in them that human eyes missed. "The tribal council voted this morning," Thomas said, entering Mary's house with legal documents and news that would reshape their strategy. "They're authorizing you to speak for the tribe in all matters related to the sacred site's protection." It was more authority than Calan had expected, more responsibility than he felt prepared to carry. But the younger tribal members had rallied behind his leadership, drawn by his military experience and his connection to Calan Crow Feather's legacy. They saw him as the bridge between their grandparents' traditional resistance and the modern legal and political warfare they needed to wage. "Desert Vista development has accelerated their timeline," Thomas continued, spreading out maps and corporate communications across Mary's kitchen table. "They're filing for emergency development permits, claiming that delayed action will cost thousands of jobs and millions in regional economic impact." The map showed a coordinated assault on Apache legal protections, simultaneous challenges in federal court, state environmental agencies, and tribal sovereignty jurisdictions. It was the kind of comprehensive legal strategy that corporations used when they wanted to overwhelm opposition with complexity and expense. "How long do we have?" Calan asked. 6 weeks before the first permits are approved, maybe less if they can prove economic hardship or public interest. Thomas's expression was grim. "They're also filing challenges to tribal standing, claiming that modern Apache people don't have legitimate spiritual connections to ancestral burial sites." The legal assault was sophisticated and well-funded, designed to attack every possible avenue of resistance. But Calan recognized the strategy from military campaigns he'd fought in Afghanistan, overwhelming force applied simultaneously across multiple fronts intended to break enemy morale before effective resistance could be organized. The problem was that Michael Hawkins would be coordinating that assault. His twin brother, the other half of his soul, was using everything at his disposal to destroy the sacred sites their ancestors had died to protect. "I need to meet with him," Calan said finally. Mary and Thomas exchanged glances. They'd been discussing this possibility for days, weighing the risks of revealing Calan's knowledge against the potential for finding common ground with someone who might not understand what he was really fighting for. "He doesn't know you exist," Mary said. "Doesn't know he's adopted, doesn't know about his Apache heritage. Showing up claiming to be his twin brother might just convince him you're mentally unstable." "But if the prophecy is right," Calan said, touching the carved wolfstone he now carried everywhere, "he's the only one who can stop this. We can file legal challenges until the courts are buried in paperwork, but ultimately they have more resources, more time, more political connections. The only thing that can stop them is someone on the inside who understands what's really at stake." Thomas pulled out his laptop and began searching through corporate databases. Michael Hawkins, Senior Vice President of Strategic Development, Meridian Industries, MBA from Wharton, law degree from Harvard. Joined the company 12 years ago, worked his way up through environmental compliance and land acquisition. He looked up from the screen. According to his corporate biography, he specializes in complex negotiations involving indigenous land rights. The irony was profound and painful. Michael had built his career on the very expertise that could protect Apache sacred sites, but he was using it to destroy them instead. "There's something else," Thomas said, his voice dropping. "I've been tracking the corporate communications around this project. Michael Hawkins isn't just managing the Apache Highlands development, he's leading it. This is his project, his strategy, his responsibility." The words hit Calan like physical blows. His twin brother wasn't just working for the enemy, he was the architect of the assault on their ancestral lands. Everything about the legal strategy, the timeline acceleration, the challenges to tribal sovereignty, it all came from the mind of someone who shared his DNA, but apparently none of his values. "The meeting needs to happen on neutral ground," Mary said after a long silence. "Somewhere spiritual, somewhere that might awaken whatever connection to the land still exists in him." They chose the spring where Calan had first opened the hidden compartment in his wagon, the place where his mother's letter had begun to reveal the truth about his past. It was sacred to the Apache, but not obviously so, a natural location that might speak to spiritual instincts Michael didn't know he possessed. The invitation was sent through corporate channels, carefully worded to suggest a negotiation opportunity, without revealing the true nature of what Calan wanted to discuss. Concerned tribal representatives seeking dialogue regarding Apache Highlands project, willing to discuss alternative approaches that might serve both corporate and Apache interests. Michael's response came within hours. Available for preliminary discussion Thursday 2 p.m., 1 hour maximum. Bring legal representation and specific proposals. Professional, efficient, focused on measurable outcomes. Everything Calan expected from someone trained in corporate negotiations, but nothing that suggested any awareness of the spiritual dimensions of what they were fighting over. The night before the meeting, Calan performed the cleansing ceremony. Mary had taught him, burning sage and sweetgrass while offering prayers to the 4 directions and the spirits of his ancestors. Dakli participated in his own way, sitting motionless during the sacred songs, his presence a bridge between the human and animal worlds. "What if he doesn't believe me?" Calan asked as the ceremony concluded. Mary's smile was patient and sad. "Faith isn't about believing what you're told. It's about recognizing what you've always known, but forgotten." She touched the prophecy stone with gentle reverence. "Your brother has spent 54 years living in a world that told him he was someone else. Tomorrow, you give him the chance to remember who he really is." As dawn broke over the mountains, painting the desert in shades of gold and rose, Calan prepared for the most important conversation of his life. Somewhere in Denver, his twin brother was probably reviewing corporate strategies and legal documents, preparing for what he thought would be a routine negotiation with another environmental activist. Neither of them was prepared for what would happen when two halves of the same soul finally met after 54 years of separation. The prophecy stone seemed to pulse with inner light as the sun reached its zenith, reminding everyone who saw it that some meetings were written in the stars. Long before the participants were born, Michael Hawkins arrived exactly on time, driving a black BMW that looked like it had never touched dirt until today. He stepped out of the air-conditioned comfort, wearing a suit that probably cost more than most reservation families spent in a month. His briefcase, expensive leather, his expression, the carefully neutral mask of a man who had learned to negotiate from positions of strength. But when he looked at Calan, something flickered behind his eyes, a moment of recognition so deep and instinctive that it transcended conscious thought. They were identical, not just similar, not just related, but mirror images of the same genetic template, the same strong jaw, the same dark eyes, the same way of carrying themselves that spoke of men who had learned to stand their ground. The only differences were the marks life had left on them, Michael's soft hands and pale skin against Calan's weathered features and military scars. "Jesus," Michael said, his professional composure cracking for the first time. "What the hell?" "My name is Calan James Crow Feather," Calan said, setting down the talking stick Mary had given him, a ceremonial object carved from oak and blessed in ceremonies older than any government. "I'm your twin brother." Michael stared at him for a full 30 seconds, his corporate-trained mind probably running through possibilities and explanations that made more sense than the truth standing in front of him. Finally, he managed, "That's impossible. I don't have a brother. I don't have any siblings. Your birth name was Michael Blue Fox Crow Feather. You were born on April 15th, 1970, 20 minutes after me, at the Indian Health Service Clinic in White River, Arizona. You had complications, breathing problems, a heart defect that required surgery. Our parents had to choose between letting you die on the reservation or letting you live in the white world. Each fact hit Michael like a physical blow. Calan could see him processing the information, trying to reconcile it with everything he'd believed about his life, his identity, his place in the world. "The Hawkinses told you that you were their biological son," Calan continued. "They promised our parents they would tell you about your Apache heritage when you were old enough to understand. They never kept that promise." Michael's briefcase hit the ground as he sat heavily on a boulder beside the spring. For the first time since arriving, he seemed to notice where they were. The natural beauty of the desert landscape, the way sunlight danced on moving water, the profound silence that existed in places untouched by human machinery. "Prove it," he said finally. Calan handed him the DNA test results, the birth certificates Mary had preserved, the photographs of two identical babies being held by different families. Michael studied each document with the careful attention of someone trained to spot forgeries and legal deceptions, but Calan could see the truth settling into him, rewriting his understanding of himself with each piece of evidence. "Why now?" Michael asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "Why are you telling me this now?" "Because the sacred burial grounds you're planning to destroy contain the graves of our great-great-grandparents." because the springs you want to poison with cyanide leaching are where our mother brought us as babies to be blessed by the tribal elders, because everything you're fighting to build will erase everything we came from." Michael looked up from the documents, his eyes showing the kind of pain that came from having your entire worldview shattered in the space of a conversation. "The Apache Highlands project will bring jobs and economic development to one of the poorest regions in the Southwest," he said, but his voice lacked the conviction it had carried in corporate boardrooms. "We're talking about transforming thousands of lives by destroying the resting place of thousands of our ancestors. They're just graves, Calan. Old graves. The people buried there have been dead for over a century." "No," Calan said, picking up the talking stick and holding it between them like a bridge across 54 years of separation. "They're not just graves. They're the foundation of who we are, the connection between past and future that defines Apache identity. Destroy them, and you destroy the spiritual heart of our people." For the first time, Michael seemed to really see the talking stick, its careful carving, its ceremonial significance, the way it had been crafted by hands that understood its sacred purpose. "I don't know how to be Apache," he said finally. "I don't know the language, don't know the ceremonies, I don't know how to connect to something I never knew existed. Neither did I 6 weeks ago. But the connection isn't something you learn, it's something you remember. It's in your DNA, in the way you respond to this landscape, in the dreams you've probably been having your whole life without understanding what they meant." Dakli chose that moment to emerge from the shade where he'd been waiting, padding over, to sit beside Michael with the same calm acceptance he'd shown around tribal elders. The wolf's presence seemed to complete something in the gathering, bridging the gap between human words and deeper understanding. Michael reached out tentatively to touch Dakli's fur, and for the first time since arriving, his expression showed wonder instead of suspicion. "What do you want me to do?" he asked. The shared cradleboard changed everything. When Calan pulled it from the wagon and set it on the ground between them, Michael's breath caught in recognition that went deeper than memory. Along the bottom edge, barely visible after 54 years, were 2 names carved with a mother's careful love, Calan James and Michael Blue Fox. "She made this for both of us," Calan said, his voice thick with emotion. "Our mother spent weeks carving the symbols, blessing each piece of wood, preparing a place where her twin sons could rest safely. She never got to see us both use it." Michael knelt beside the cradleboard, his corporate executive fingers tracing the Apache symbols with something approaching reverence. "What do they mean?" "Protection. Family. The connection between earth and sky that holds all life in balance." Calan settled beside his brother, both men finally occupying the same space after 54 years of separation. "The wolf represents spiritual guidance. The eagle represents the ability to see from great heights, to understand the bigger picture. The mountain represents strength that endures through all seasons." As if summoned by the mention of his spiritual significance, Dakli moved to lie beside the cradleboard, his presence completing a circle that had been broken since birth. "I've been having dreams," Michael said suddenly, "for months now. Dreams. About desert landscapes, about ceremonies I've never seen, about a wolf that seemed to be waiting for something." He looked at Dakli with new understanding. "I thought I was losing my mind. You were remembering who you are." They spent the next hour sharing memories that should have been impossible. Michael describing dreams of Apache ceremonies, while Calan recalled similar visions during his years of wandering. 2 halves of the same soul, finally comparing notes on a spiritual inheritance they'd both carried without understanding. "The project has to be stopped," Michael said finally. "But I can't just walk away from Meridian Industries. They've invested too much money, hired too many people, made too many political commitments. If I try to sabotage it from the inside, they'll destroy me professionally and find someone else to finish the job." Calan had been thinking about this problem for weeks, using his military training to develop strategies that could work against a better-funded enemy. What if you didn't have to sabotage it? What if you could transform it instead? He pulled out maps and documents Thomas had prepared, showing alternative development possibilities that could provide economic benefits without destroying sacred sites. Solar installations on already disturbed land, ecotourism that showcased Apache culture and natural beauty, educational partnerships with universities interested in sustainable development models, Meridian Industries once profit and positive. Publicity, Calan continued. They don't care whether it comes from copper mining or renewable energy projects. But they need someone inside the company who can sell the alternatives to corporate leadership. Michael studied the proposals with the same intensity he'd applied to the original mining project. This could work. The profit margins are actually better long-term, and the environmental impact assessments would be much easier to obtain. He looked up at Calan with something that might have been admiration. Where did you learn corporate strategy? 23 years of asymmetric warfare. You learn to think like the enemy in order to defeat them. But in this case, we don't need to defeat Meridian Industries. We need to convince them that our goals align with theirs. Over the next 2 hours, the brothers worked together to refine a proposal that could satisfy corporate shareholders while protecting Apache's sacred sites. Michael contributed his knowledge of regulatory requirements and corporate decision-making processes, while Calan provided strategic thinking and deep understanding of what the tribal community would accept. The sun was beginning to set by the time they had a workable plan. Michael would return to Denver and begin building internal support for the alternative development approach, using his corporate credibility to sell sustainability as a profit opportunity. Calan would work with tribal leadership to build consensus around the modified proposals, ensuring that Apache spiritual concerns were addressed while economic development proceeded on mutually acceptable terms. "There's one more thing," Calan said as they prepared to part ways. He reached into his pocket and pulled out the carved wolfstone from his mother's medicine bundle. "This belongs to both of us." Michael held the turquoise wolf up to the fading light, its blue-green surface seeming to pulse within a fire. "I can't take this. I don't know how to honor it properly." "You don't have to know everything immediately. But you need to remember that you're not just Michael Hawkins, the corporate executive, anymore. You're Michael Blue Fox Crow Feather, son of Maria and James, brother to Calan, member of the Apache Nation." Calan smiled, feeling something healing in his chest after decades of carrying the wound of separation. The rest you can learn as you go. As Michael drove away, his taillights disappearing into the desert darkness, Dakli padded over to sit beside Calan. The wolf's amber eyes reflected the first stars appearing overhead, and for the first time in 54 years, Calan felt complete. The prophecy was beginning to fulfill itself. Two halves of the same soul had been reunited, and together they would either heal the wound in the earth or complete its destruction. The outcome would depend on whether a corporate executive could remember how to be Apache, and whether an Apache warrior could learn to fight battles in conference rooms instead of on mountainsides. 6 months later, the transformed wagon rolled through the desert on a spring morning that painted the landscape in shades of hope and renewal. What had begun as a broken shell rusting in Tommy Begay's lot had become something unprecedented. A mobile cultural center that bridged two worlds with the same elegance their mother had once dreamed possible. Michael had kept his word. The Apache Highlands mining project had been transformed into the Apache Highlands Cultural Preserve and Renewable Energy Initiative, a partnership between Meridian Industries and the Apache Tribal Council that protected sacred sites while generating sustainable revenue through solar installations and educational tourism. The corporate boardroom battles had been fierce, but Michael's combination of business acumen and newfound spiritual purpose had proven irresistible to shareholders who discovered that environmental sustainability could be more profitable than environmental destruction. Okay. Calan guided the wagon along a newly constructed road that wound respectfully around burial sites and sacred springs, following a route that honored the landscape rather than conquering it. Beside him, Dakli rode in the passenger seat with the dignity of a wolf who had successfully guided two lost souls back to themselves. The wagon itself had been restored with a reverence that honored both its practical heritage and its spiritual significance. The canvas cover was new, but crafted in traditional patterns that told the story of the Crow Feather family's journey from separation to reunion. Solar panels integrated seamlessly into the roof provided power for the educational equipment inside, computers, projectors, and communication systems that could bring Apache culture to schools and communities across the Southwest. But it was the interior that truly captured the miracle of transformation. Where once there had been decay and abandonment, now there were display cases holding artifacts that told the story of Apache resistance and resilience. Photographs of James Crow Feather receiving his Medal of Honor shared space with images of traditional ceremonies and modern tribal achievements. Maps showed the locations of protected sacred sites alongside renewable energy installations that proved conservation and progress could coexist. At the center of it all was the shared cradleboard, mounted in a place of honor where visitors could understand that this story began with a mother's love for twin sons she would never see grow to manhood. Next stop is the Flagstaff School District, Michael said, consulting the tablet that had replaced traditional corporate briefcases in his new role as Director of Cultural Partnerships for the Apache Meridian Initiative. 3 elementary schools want presentations about traditional ecological knowledge and sustainable energy practices. He looked different now, still professional, but with turquoise jewelry that connected him to his heritage and the kind of confidence that came from understanding one's true purpose. The corporate suits had given way to clothing that honored both worlds he now inhabited, bridging business necessity with cultural authenticity. The transformation hadn't been easy. There had been corporate executives who resented the project, changes, federal bureaucrats who struggled with the innovative partnership model, and tribal members who questioned whether any collaboration with former enemies could be trusted. But the results spoke for themselves. Sacred sites protected permanently, sustainable jobs created for tribal members, educational opportunities that strengthened Apache culture while generating revenue that funded tribal programs. "Mary's riding with the support team today," Calan said, gesturing toward a modern RV that followed at a respectful distance. Inside, Mary Littlefoot and Thomas Yazzie worked with a team of tribal educators and former corporate executives who had discovered that teaching children about indigenous wisdom was more satisfying than extracting resources from the land. The convoy also included something that would have seemed impossible 6 months ago: 3 other wolves that Dakli had somehow convinced to join their mobile pack. They were rescue animals from various wildlife rehabilitation centers, each one bonded to specific members of the educational team in ways that defied conventional understanding of interspecies relationships. "The university wants to study our pack integration model," Michael said, scratching behind the ears of a gray female wolf named Sierra who had claimed him as her partner. "They're saying it could revolutionize wildlife rehabilitation programs." Calan smiled, watching Dakli lead the other wolves in what looked like a strategic patrol of their route. "Some things can't be studied, brother. They can only be experienced." The word brother still carried profound weight between them, representing not just blood relationship, but the healing of a wound that had shaped both their lives. They had learned to work together with an efficiency that amazed everyone who observed them, completing each other's thoughts, anticipating each other's needs, functioning as 2 halves of a whole that had finally been reunited. As they crested a hill that offered panoramic views of the Apache homeland, Calan pulled the wagon to a stop at an overlook that had become their traditional pause point. The landscape spread before them in all directions, protected burial grounds marked by traditional cairns, solar installations that generated clean energy without disturbing sacred sites, and in the distance, the mountains where their father had fought and died to preserve this very view. He would be proud, Michael said quietly, following Calan's gaze toward James Crow Feather's memorial marker. Both of our parents would be proud. Mary had told them stories about their mothers, prophecies, visions of twin sons who would heal the earth by learning to work together despite being raised in different worlds. Maria Blue Fox Crow Feather had seen this moment in dreams decades before it became reality, understanding that sometimes the greatest healing required the deepest separation. "The boarding schools in Saskatchewan want us next month," Calan said, consulting their schedule. Then the environmental conference in Washington, and after that, the UN presentation on Indigenous rights and sustainable development. Their mobile cultural center had become something neither of them had expected, a powerful symbol of what was possible when traditional wisdom and modern resources worked together instead of against each other. Requests for presentations came from around the world, from educational institutions and governments seeking models for reconciling development with environmental protection. But it was the small moments that mattered most. The elementary school. Children whose eyes lit up when they learned about wolfpack dynamics, the tribal elders who shared stories that had been passed down for generations, the corporate executives who discovered that profit and principle didn't have to be mutually exclusive. "Sometimes I dream about her," Michael said, as they prepared to continue their journey. "Our mother. She's standing beside the wagon watching us work together and she's smiling." Calan nodded, understanding. He had the same dreams, visions of Maria Blue Fox Crow Feather seeing her twin sons finally united in purpose and love. In those dreams, she held the original cradleboard, rocking gently as she sang lullabies in Apache that somehow both brothers understood. As the wagon rolled toward Flagstaff and another opportunity to share their story, Dakli and the other wolves ranged ahead, scouting the route with the ancient wisdom of creatures who understood that protection came from vigilance, that family required loyalty, and that some bonds transcended the boundaries between species. The desert stretched endlessly, in all directions, patient as stone, holding its secrets and its blessings for those wise enough to listen. In the distance, children were waiting to learn about traditional ecological knowledge from men who had discovered that the oldest wisdom was often the most practical, that protecting the sacred was the best way to ensure the future. The covered wagon that had begun as a symbol of abandonment and loss had become a testament to the power of healing, the possibility of reunion, and the truth that some stories are too important to end with separation. Behind them, the sacred burial grounds remained protected, the springs ran clean, and the ancestors rested in peace, knowing that their descendants had remembered who they were and why they mattered. The sun climbed higher, and the desert blessed. Their journey with the kind of light that made everything seem possible